According to reporting from Rob Shooter, Prince Harry's unexpected private meeting with King Charles was not primarily about family reconciliation or forgiveness. Instead, sources suggest it was driven by preparations for a more serious contingency. One royal insider claims the king's health is significantly worse than official palace statements indicate, and that this is why Harry was called in. The discussions concerned succession rather than healing old wounds. The contrast with the late Queen Elizabeth II is notable. She is said to have privately managed cancer in her final years, shielding even close family members from the full details. Charles took a different path, publicly disclosing his diagnosis in February 2024 after prostate surgery uncovered a more serious condition. Some palace sources now view that openness as a strategic misstep. Once the public understands that a reigning monarch is gravely ill, they argue, the balance of power and influence begins to shift, and that process is already underway. Picture the Duke of Sussex, a man who once served with genuine distinction in the British Armed Forces. Today, according to multiple reports circulating in Whitehall and Fleet Street, he has become the subject of discussions inside MI6, the same intelligence service that monitors hostile foreign actors, state-sponsored espionage, and threats to national security. In the present day, tabloid and commentary circles portray the former Spare as a volatile figure whose actions have drawn the attention of the United Kingdom's security apparatus. Let that claim settle. Not a foreign adversary or rogue state, but Prince Harry himself. This is the same prince who, not long ago, was widely regarded as the nation's golden boy, the affable redhead who charmed older generations across the Commonwealth and briefly made the monarchy feel more approachable and human. That era of goodwill has ended. What has taken its place, according to a growing number of royal commentators, insiders, and frustrated observers, is a pattern critics describe as reckless and self-serving. Most damagingly, they allege a calculated use of his own children, Archie and Lilibet, as part of the public spectacle. This analysis examines the latest and most contentious chapter in the ongoing conflict between the Sussexes and the Crown. It considers the alleged threats, reports that King Charles has refused to yield to certain demands involving his grandchildren, and the increasingly uncomfortable question being voiced across Britain, the Commonwealth, and even in the United States. At what point does a private family dispute cease to be private and become a national embarrassment? To understand the current situation, and the word crisis is not overstated when applied to the stability of an institution that has endured for a millennium, one must return to first principles. Not to the Netflix series, the Oprah interview, or the memoir Spare, but to the unspoken bargain every member of the British royal family accepts upon birth into the House of Windsor: serve, sacrifice, and remain silent. It is neither glamorous nor fair by modern standards, and it would not survive scrutiny from any contemporary human resources department. Yet it has been the enduring compact. For generations, even deeply unhappy or heavily scrutinized members of the family largely upheld it, gritting their teeth, smiling for the cameras, and performing walkabouts in rain-soaked towns across Yorkshire and the Scottish Highlands, shaking hands with strangers who would remember the moment for a lifetime even if the royal could not wait to return to the car. By most credible accounts, Prince Harry himself honored that bargain for a substantial part of his adult life. His military service was authentic. His work with the Invictus Games was substantive and meaningful. His warmth and relatability were, at least initially, genuine rather than manufactured. He was widely seen as the most popular younger royal, the one the public actually liked. Then the shift occurred. The official Sussex account, carefully presented through podcasts, television appearances, and a best-selling memoir, attributes the change entirely to the toxic British tabloid press and alleged institutional racism within the royal household. Those criticisms of the press are not without foundation. The treatment of Meghan Markle was, in many documented instances, appalling, racially charged, and indefensible. No serious observer disputes this. To pretend otherwise would be dishonest. Yet this is also where the narrative begins to fracture. The carefully constructed story of pure victimhood develops cracks that even sympathetic observers find difficult to overlook. In short, the reported reunion between Harry and Charles was not merely a personal rapprochement. According to the sources and commentators cited, it reflected deeper concerns about the king's health, the mechanics of succession, and the widening perception that a once-admired prince has become a destabilizing force whose private grievances now risk broader institutional and national consequences. The meeting between Prince Harry and King Charles was not a warm, reassuring family reunion. According to the reporting, it served as a stark reminder that Britain's king may have limited time remaining. Harry spent less than half an hour with his father. Multiple accounts frame the encounter as driven primarily by the king's health and by Charles's desire to maintain some form of contact with his two grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet. The broader discussion has shifted. The question is no longer only what was done to Harry and Meghan. It is now about the choices they have made in response. Those choices, observers increasingly argue, amount to a scorched earth strategy. No concessions, no bridges left standing, and maximum pressure applied. Reports from royal correspondents and palace-adjacent sources describe escalating demands from the Sussex side. These go well beyond the familiar arguments over titles, security arrangements, or seating at Christmas gatherings at Sandringham. At the center of the dispute, according to these accounts, is the status and public visibility of Archie and Lilibet. Harry is said to have made clear that he expects his children to be fully embraced, publicly acknowledged, and given the same ceremonial and symbolic standing as the children of the Prince and Princess of Wales, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. On the surface, the request can appear reasonable. A father naturally wants equal treatment for his children, and the optics of any perceived hierarchy are uncomfortable in an age highly attuned to fairness and inclusion. Yet the British monarchy is neither a democracy nor a corporation with a formal grievance process. It is a constitutional institution governed by long-established rules, precedents, and protocols that have evolved, sometimes reformed over centuries. The frameworks surrounding titles, the line of succession, and the public roles of more distant royals exist for a purpose, to preserve the stability on which the institution ultimately depends. King Charles, by multiple accounts, has drawn a firm boundary. He is described as willing to sustain a private, personal relationship with his grandchildren, quiet visits, family gatherings, and behind-the-scenes grandfathering that require no press releases or balcony appearances. What he is reportedly unwilling to do is restructure the public-facing hierarchy of the monarchy to meet demands he regards as destabilizing, self-interested, and, in internal discussions, performative. This is the point at which alleged threats enter the reporting. The precise nature of any such threats remains opaque, as private conversations between a father and an estranged son are not public. Still, the pattern described is one of escalation, implied consequences if the demands are refused, suggestions of further revelations, and indications that the Sussex media operation, already responsible for a Netflix series, a best-selling memoir, and a steady stream of timed interviews, has not exhausted its capacity to apply pressure. In effect, the reported stance is that the institution and the family will continue to face difficulty until the requested concessions are granted. If even partially accurate, the posture is striking. A member of the royal family who continues to benefit from residual security arrangements, global recognition, and the goodwill attached to his birthright is portrayed as leveraging those advantages against his own relatives for purposes critics link to personal brand management. The collateral figures in this dynamic are two young children who never sought any of it. That reality should give pause. Archie Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Mountbatten-Windsor are not political instruments, bargaining chips, or material for another documentary. They are children. One of them is already old enough to begin forming lasting memories of the world around him. The Sussex public relations effort has worked hard to keep attention elsewhere. The reporting now forces a more uncomfortable examination of the human cost. Meanwhile, mainstream coverage this week has continued to float the idea that Harry remains a beloved figure the British public is eager to welcome back. Critics of that narrative dismiss it as a spent notion, one that no longer matches the prevailing public mood. One of the children is already old enough to begin forming lasting memories of the world around him. The other remains young enough to be largely unaware that her name has become a flashpoint in a transatlantic media conflict. Yet, according to the direction of the Sussex approach, both children are being placed deliberately and with growing frequency at the center of a public confrontation between their parents and the British Crown. Consider the timeline of carefully staged public moments involving Archie and Lilibet, the Platinum Jubilee, the late Queen's funeral, and the coronation of King Charles. Each appearance, the commentary suggests, was calibrated for maximum emotional effect and deployed with the precision of a military operation, an observation that, given Harry's service background, may not be entirely coincidental. The consistent message is clear. Look at what you are denying these children. Look at the beautiful young faces the cold institution is withholding from full public embrace. From a purely tactical perspective, the strategy is highly effective. It generates sympathy and positions the royal family as the antagonists in a narrative the Sussexes have shaped, edited, and directed since their departure in January 2020. From an ethical perspective, however, the same pattern is described as deeply troubling. Critics argue that no responsible parent weaponizes their children in a public dispute or turns their images into ammunition in a media campaign. This is the trajectory that has drawn increasing concern from royal observers, child psychologists, and even some previously sympathetic commentators. The irony is pronounced. The Sussexes cited the need to protect their children from the intense glare of public scrutiny as a primary reason for stepping back from royal life. Through their subsequent actions, those same children have become more publicly scrutinized, more politically charged, and more entangled in celebrity media machinery than most of their peers. Claiming to shield children from the spotlight while repeatedly placing them at the center of news cycles creates a contradiction that is difficult to ignore. The fact that large parts of the media have largely accepted the framing is attributed less to the internal consistency of the narrative than to the effectiveness of its management. Attention then turns to the figure at the center of these pressures, King Charles. He ascended the throne under circumstances of profound personal and institutional strain, the death of a mother who, for all her complexities, remained one of the most recognizable figures of the 20th century. He inherited an institution already under strain, a public in mourning, and a family more fractured than any modern predecessor had faced. His reward, according to this analysis, has been a sustained, multi-platform campaign of criticism led by his own younger son. Charles is not presented as a flawless figure. His earlier treatment of Diana is widely regarded as inadequate at best and, in the eyes of many, deeply damaging. His environmental advocacy, while principled in intent, has at times struck observers as overbearing. His marriage to Camilla continues to provoke residual resentment among a portion of the British public. Yet the relevant standard, the argument continues, is not personal perfection but institutional stewardship. By that measure, Charles is credited in his relatively short reign with seriousness of purpose, a measured willingness to modernize, and notable restraint in the face of provocation. He has not retaliated with explosive interviews or produced a documentary series examining the shortcomings of his children. Instead, he has absorbed the pressure, preserved the dignity of the office, and continued the work of the monarchy. Despite this, the demands persist. Alleged threats or implied escalations continue, and pressure mounts from a media environment that profits from prolonging the conflict. The refusal to grant Archie and Lilibet the full public and ceremonial standing that Harry is reported to demand is framed not as cruelty, but as institutional self-preservation. Yielding to what is characterized as public blackmail, however it may be packaged in the language of family reconciliation, would establish a precedent that no future sovereign could safely accept. If the Crown were to bend each time a dissatisfied family member threatened further disclosures or media campaigns, the long-term stability of the institution itself would be placed at risk. If every dissatisfied member of the family turns to the press whenever grievances arise, the Crown ceases to function as a constitutional institution. It risks becoming little more than a reality television spectacle with superior headwear. King Charles, whatever his personal shortcomings, appears to grasp this reality with a clarity that his younger son either does not share or chooses to disregard. The counterargument is predictable and already familiar to those who have followed the story with lingering sympathy for the Sussexes. They were hurt, mistreated, and effectively driven out. What else are they supposed to do? Remain silent? The answer, according to this analysis, is yes. That is precisely what the role demands. Not because their pain was imaginary or the mistreatment fabricated, but because the institution they once joined, and from which they continue to draw tangible and intangible benefits, requires a degree of discretion incompatible with the scorched earth media strategy they have pursued. It is not possible to retain the titles, the residual security arrangements, the global platform, and the lingering mystique of royal birth while simultaneously working to dismantle the institution that supplies those advantages. The contradiction is intellectually incoherent and strategically self-defeating. Increasingly, it appears less like a principled stand and more like a tantrum of historic scale. The wider consequences for the monarchy are substantial. Each headline, each leaked allegation, and each carefully timed revelation further erodes the public trust on which the institution depends. In an era when Republican sentiment is no longer confined to the political fringe, but has grown, particularly among younger demographics across the Commonwealth, the Sussex campaign is portrayed as inflicting more damage on the crown than any external critic could achieve. Harry may believe he is pursuing justice or protecting his family. Outside the closed circle of supportive commentators and Hollywood allies, the observable result is different. He is accelerating the gradual diminishment of the British monarchy as a unifying national force, the very outcome his grandmother spent 70 years working to prevent. And he is doing so, the argument continues, while using his children's images as the primary instrument of pressure. Where does this leave the situation? It leaves a prince who has largely exhausted an extraordinary store of public goodwill. Once the most relatable, popular, and human member of the younger royal generation, he has, through a succession of decisions widely viewed as self-destructive, become a figure of ridicule in the country he still claims to care for. It leaves a king attempting, against significant odds, to preserve an institution older than most modern nation-states while being actively undermined by his own son. And it leaves two young children, Archie and Lilibet, whose early years are being shaped not by the quiet, protected ordinary life their parents say they desire, but by the continuous churn of a media conflict that shows little sign of ending. The suggestions of MI6 involvement may be overstated. The precise character of any alleged threats may have been amplified by a tabloid culture that thrives on royal dysfunction. Yet the underlying pattern is presented as genuine, the escalation is real, and the use of the children, whether deliberate strategy or the unavoidable byproduct of a media-first approach, is real. It is time, the commentary concludes, for the public to stop treating the saga as mere entertainment and to recognize it for what it is, a cautionary example of the corrosive effects of sustained grievance, entitlement, and the insistence on fighting certain battles in public even when the personal justification feels strong. Prince Harry retains a choice. He could step back, allow the noise to subside, and offer his children the privacy and peace that no volume of media deals or book advances can purchase. The freedom to grow up without their names repeatedly trending whenever their father decides the world needs another installment of his account. On the evidence to date, that is not the path he is taking. The public, the press, and the institutions that continue to amplify the spectacle share some responsibility for permitting it to persist. The crown itself will endure. It has weathered worse. The damage being done to the individuals caught within the conflict, and especially to the children, continues. The damage done to the two young children at the center of this conflict may prove far harder to mend than any institutional strain. Edward VIII is often remembered in the romantic version of history as the king who gave up everything for love. The less sentimental account, assembled by historians from declassified files and private correspondence, presents a different figure, lazy, self-absorbed, politically naive, and fundamentally unsuited to the demands of the throne. His abdication was less a noble sacrifice than a relief for nearly everyone involved, except his brother Bertie, who inherited a poisoned chalice and spent the remainder of his life managing the consequences of someone else's choices. The comparison is not offered because Prince Harry is about to abdicate. He cannot formally renounce a role he has already, in practical terms, abandoned. It is offered because the parallels between the two men have become difficult to overlook. Both represent a pattern in which a royal son elevates personal grievances above institutional duty, a pattern that has appeared before in British history and has rarely ended well for the individual who walks away. There is, however, a significant difference. Edward left quietly. He married Wallis Simpson, settled into a life of gilded exile, occasionally made tone-deaf remarks, and largely faded from the center of public attention. Harry has not left quietly. He is left with a Netflix series, a Spotify deal that was terminated before it fully developed, a ghost-written memoir that sold millions by disclosing the family's most private difficulties, and a public relations approach so persistent and self-focused that even some former supporters in the British media have begun to distance themselves. According to the latest round of reports that have unsettled both Westminster and Windsor, the conflict has now been escalated to a level described in cautious and alarmed terms as a direct challenge to the stability of the monarchy. That challenge is said to have drawn the attention of MI6 and, at its core, involves the two people who ought to be furthest from any such battlefield, his children, Archie and Lilibet. The alleged sequence of events requires careful attention because the Sussex media operation has become highly skilled at shaping the narrative, often burying the underlying facts beneath layers of selective framing. Harry is portrayed as believing he has endured lifelong marginalization and that the institution is now attempting to sideline his children in the same way. His response, according to these accounts, has not been patience, private negotiation, or the quiet diplomacy that has traditionally characterized royal disagreements. Instead, it has taken the form of threats. The precise content of any such threats remains deliberately vague, and for good reason. Private conversations between a king and his estranged son are not public record, and anyone claiming exact knowledge is either fabricating or breaching confidences that should remain closed. The broad outline, however, is presented as clear. If the Crown does not meet Harry's demands concerning his children's status and visibility, the Sussex media apparatus will be activated once more. Further interviews, additional revelations, and carefully staged moments of emotional intensity calculated to inflict maximum reputational harm on the monarchy at moments when it is least able to absorb the blow. The timing of earlier interventions is cited as evidence of this approach. The Oprah interview was broadcast while the Queen was still alive and the institution was navigating the fragile final phase of her reign. The Netflix documentary appeared during the uncertain transition that followed her death. The publication of Spare coincided with the early months of Charles's reign, when the new king was seeking to establish authority and project continuity. Each release, the argument runs, was timed with precision to create the greatest possible disruption. This is characterized not as the conduct of someone seeking reconciliation, but as the conduct of someone running a sustained campaign, and campaigns require ammunition. That brings the discussion, inevitably and uncomfortably, back to Archie and Lilibet. This is the element of the Sussex story that is presented as most troubling. Whenever the Sussex brand appears to need a fresh infusion of emotional capital, the children are brought forward, not for private family occasions or quiet, unpublicized time with their grandparents, but for public consumption, for the cameras, and for the narrative. The entire post-royal identity of the Sussexes rests on the claim that they left in order to protect their children. That assertion is the foundational story of their departure. Yet the observable pattern since leaving, the commentary contends, points in the opposite direction. Since leaving the royal family, Archie and Lilibet have been exposed to greater public attention, media scrutiny, and political use than they would almost certainly have faced had their parents remained inside the institutional structure they say they escaped. Within the royal family, the children of the younger son tend to remain largely invisible to the public. They attend school without fanfare, grow up away from constant cameras, and are shielded by a mixture of institutional discretion and the practical reality that the press has less commercial incentive to pursue them. Outside that framework, under the current Sussex approach, they function as brand assets, evidence points in a narrative of persecution, and the emotional core of carefully constructed appeals for public sympathy. Children are not protected by being turned into content. They are not shielded from scrutiny by becoming among the most recognizable faces in the English-speaking world. And their long-term interests are not served by embedding them in a public conflict that will inevitably form part of their own biographical record, a conflict they will one day be old enough to research, read about, and judge for themselves. One wonders whether Harry has fully considered that future moment. 10 or 15 years from now, when Archie sits with a copy of Spare and reads his father's account of his grandmother, his uncle, and the institution that shaped their family for centuries. Or when Lilibet discovers that the name she shares with a queen who devoted her life to public service was deployed as a bargaining element in negotiations she never chose. It is possible that Harry has weighed these questions and concluded that the short-term advantages, the media contracts, the book advances, the affirmation of the Hollywood social world, outweigh the longer-term costs his children may eventually bear. His internal calculations cannot be known. Only the external pattern can be observed, and that pattern is not reassuring. King Charles's position in this sequence of events is, on this reading, considerably more sympathetic than the Sussex narrative allows. At an advanced age, after waiting longer than any previous British heir to ascend the throne, he endured decades of public mockery and personal difficulty before finally taking the crown at a moment when the institution was arguably more fragile than at any time since the abdication crisis of 1936. He is managing a cancer diagnosis with a degree of dignity and openness that stands in contrast to earlier royal approaches to illness. He is attempting to modernize an institution resistant to rapid change, navigating a commonwealth increasingly prepared to question the monarchy's relevance, and doing so while his younger son conducts a sustained, high-profile, internationally amplified campaign that challenges his authority at nearly every turn. The restraint Charles has shown is striking. Most fathers, royal or not, would have lost patience long ago with the scale of public criticism Harry has directed at the family. Most heads of state would have responded to what is characterized as institutional sabotage with measures stronger than a quiet refusal to grant full ceremonial standing to 2 grandchildren he is said to love and wish to see privately. Charles, however, appears to grasp something his son, in his present state of grievance, does not, that the monarchy is larger than any single individual, that decisions made now will echo across generations, and that yielding to public pressure from a family member already prepared to treat every concession as a platform for further demands would not end the conflict, it would simply invite the next escalation. This is presented not as cruelty, but as institutional statecraft, a form of judgment that Harry, despite his military background and professed sense of duty, seems unable or unwilling to recognize. The MI6 element of the story, the detail that has produced the most dramatic headlines, requires a moment of measured consideration. Is it plausible that Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service would actively monitor the communications of a member of the royal family? On its face, the suggestion that MI6 is involved sounds absurd. The service is concerned with international threats, not domestic family disputes. Context, however, changes the picture. Harry is a former military officer who possesses knowledge of classified operations. He is a British citizen living in the United States, married to an American citizen, and surrounded by a circle of advisors, publicists, and associates whose loyalties and motives are not always transparent. By his own account, he has shared sensitive information in public settings. According to the reports, his current demands touch on questions of national security, constitutional protocol, and the diplomatic relationships between the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. In that light, the idea that the security services might be paying closer attention than usual is less far-fetched than it first appears. It does not mean Harry is being treated as a hostile actor, nor that agents are stationed outside his Montecito home. It does suggest that the situation has moved beyond the ordinary channels of royal family management and that the consequences of his actions now reach past the personal into the institutional. For a man who once swore an oath to defend the very state apparatus now said to be monitoring him more closely, that fact alone should be a source of deep embarrassment. What happens next is genuinely unknown. The Sussex strategy, successful in commercial terms for a time, appears to be approaching the limits of its effectiveness. Audience figures for the Netflix projects have declined. Book sales have leveled off. The broad public sympathy that once flowed freely has given way to fatigue and, increasingly, irritation. The British public in particular has a long memory and limited patience for what it perceives as ingratitude. The image of a prince who received every material and social advantage life could offer, now complaining about his circumstances from a multi-million-dollar California mansion, has begun to wear thin. Harry's window of cultural relevance is narrowing. The institutions he has criticized are adapting. The public he once charmed is moving on. And the children he says he is fighting to protect grow older with every month, moving closer to the age at which they will start asking questions that no amount of public relations framing will fully answer. The tragedy of Prince Harry is not that he experienced mistreatment. In certain respects he did, and that reality deserves acknowledgement. The deeper tragedy is that he has allowed legitimate grievances to grow into a consuming obsession, one that is damaging his relationships, eroding his credibility, and, most unforgivably, drawing his children into a conflict that will shape their lives long after the cameras stop and the headlines fade. Edward VIII walked away from the crown and spent the rest of his days in comfortable irrelevance. Harry appears to want both the freedom of exile and the privileges of belonging, to burn the house down and still be invited to the table. That contradiction cannot be maintained indefinitely. The longer the attempt continues, the greater the harm inflicted on the institution, on his family, and most painfully on the two young children whose faces continue to be held up as shields, as instruments of pressure, and as evidence of a victimhood that the accumulating record increasingly suggests is, in large part, self-created. The crown will endure, as it always has. But the boy who once stood on palace balconies waving to crowds of well-wishers has become something his grandmother would have recognized with regret, a cautionary example of what follows when duty is set aside, when grievance is placed above service, and when the advantages of birth are treated not as responsibilities, but as entitlements to be leveraged for personal advantage. History will form its judgment of Prince Harry, and history, unlike the algorithm, does not measure success by engagement metrics. There is a further turning point worth noting. At the moment the Duke of Sussex, who had long insisted he wanted nothing more than to be left alone, entered a series of commercial agreements valued, by conservative estimates, at well over $100 million, each of which required him to do the very thing he claimed to despise, place himself, his wife, his children, and the family's most private matters on public display for a global audience. From that point forward, he was no longer a prince in any substantial sense of the word. He had become a content creator, a brand, and an asset managed by publicists, agents, and entertainment executives. There is a noticeable effort in some quarters of the media to rehabilitate Prince Harry's image at present. Yet the attempt to portray the recent meeting as a positive or constructive development sits uneasily with the reported reality. Charles had not seen his son for roughly 18 months, and the encounter itself was brief and overshadowed by far weightier concerns. The more revealing lens through which to examine the latest chapter of the Sussex saga, the alleged threats, the reported interest from MI6, and the standoff with King Charles over the status of Archie and Lilibet, is commercial rather than familial. Harry is no longer functioning primarily as a member of a family. He is operating as the public face of a commercial enterprise. The primary obligation of that enterprise is not to the British monarchy, not to the Commonwealth, and not to the emotional welfare of two young children in Montecito. It is to the financial bottom line of a corporate structure that requires a continuous flow of public engagement to sustain its value. Once this is understood, the pattern of behavior that has confused and alienated many former supporters becomes coherent, if unsettling. No account of the Sussex strategy is complete without examining the network of enablers that has driven it. Harry did not arrive in California and spontaneously launch a multi-platform media campaign against the royal family. He was advised, guided, and, on this reading, shaped by a circle of Hollywood professionals whose expertise lies in narrative construction, brand management, and the commercial exploitation of personal difficulty rather than in family reconciliation. The key figures are well known: the publicists who arranged the Oprah interview, the literary agents who secured the memoir contract, the entertainment lawyers who structured the Netflix arrangement, and the advisors who framed Harry's pain as not only valid but marketable, his grievances as not only personal but politically potent, and the institution of his birth as not merely imperfect but fundamentally illegitimate. These are the people who have steered the Sussex narrative from the outset, and they are the people with the most to lose if that narrative ever loses its momentum. The uncomfortable commercial reality is that the Sussex brand requires ongoing conflict. It requires the royal family to remain the antagonist. It requires the grievances to stay current, the wounds to stay open, and a portion of the public to remain outraged. The moment genuine reconciliation occurs, the commercial logic of the entire enterprise disappears. Streaming platforms do not renew contracts with people who have made quiet peace with their families. Publishers do not pay eight-figure advances for accounts of private lives lived away from the cameras. The attention economy rewards sustained drama, not resolution. Therefore, the drama continues, the pressure escalates, the children remain visible, and the wound is kept open. This is not conspiracy, it is a business model, and Prince Harry, whether he fully recognizes it or not, is its most valuable asset. The substance of the demands themselves reveals a wide gap between the Sussex framing and constitutional reality. Harry is said to want Archie and Lilibet treated as full, equal, publicly recognized members of the royal family, with the same titles, ceremonial roles, and visibility as the children of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Framed as a simple matter of fairness and basic decency, the request can sound unassailable in the abstract. The monarchy, however, does not operate in the abstract. It operates under a specific legal framework, the central element of which remains the letters patent issued by King George V in 1917. Those letters patent, still in force, restrict the style of Royal Highness and the titles of Prince or Princess to the children of the sovereign, the children of the sovereign's sons, and the eldest living son of the eldest son of the Prince of Wales. This is not a question of personal preference or institutional prejudice. It is a matter of established law, one that King Charles, despite his authority as monarch, cannot simply set aside to accommodate his younger son. Throughout the modern history of the British monarchy, the children of the younger son have never held the same formal status as the children of the heir. Princess Margaret's children did not receive royal titles. The children of the Duke of York occupy a different constitutional position from those of the Prince of Wales. The arrangement is not a recent invention directed at Harry, it is the long-standing architecture of the institution, in place for more than a century. To demand that Charles override this framework is, in practical terms, to ask the king to rewrite core constitutional rules of the monarchy in order to settle a personal grievance, an action that is structurally and politically untenable. The Sussexes' campaigns and complaints have long been presented as urgent and dramatic, yet they remain largely unnecessary for the welfare of their children. Archie and Lilibet, as the offspring of a duke, already occupy a place among the most privileged fraction of the world's population in both social standing and financial security. Facts, however, have never been the central currency of the Sussex project. Narrative has always taken precedence, and that narrative demands a clear villain, a perceived injustice, and a David versus Goliath storyline in which a courageous, embattled couple confronts the supposedly cold and unfeeling machinery of the establishment. The constitutional reality that the rules of the institution are fixed, apply equally, and were well known to Harry from birth, does not fit this preferred story. Consequently, those realities are routinely set aside, downplayed, or reframed as further evidence of institutional cruelty. The financial record is equally hard to square with claims of principled sacrifice. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from royal duties in 2020, they cited a desire for privacy, independence, and freedom from institutional constraints. In the years that followed, they secured highly lucrative commercial arrangements that would have been impossible without the royal status and connections they purported to reject. Early reports valued their Netflix partnership at more than $100 million over 5 years. Later accounts placed the actual figure closer to $60 million. Harry's memoir Spare formed part of a multi-book publishing agreement estimated at around $40 million, with an advance reported in the region of $20 million. Additional income has come from speaking engagements, brand partnerships, and other ventures. Far from material sacrifice, the couple have converted their titles, grievances, and residual royal associations into a commercial enterprise, literally monetizing the birthright they claimed to leave behind, while continuing to portray themselves as victims of the system that enabled their wealth. The visual and practical contrast is stark. They have lived in a Montecito estate purchased for approximately $14.65 million in one of California's most affluent postcodes, maintained private security, initially partly underwritten by British taxpayers, traveled extensively by private jet, and moved in elite Hollywood and international circles. Yet the consistent message from their circle has been one of ongoing persecution and marginalization. British public opinion has registered the discrepancy. Sympathy that once existed has largely given way to skepticism or outright disapproval. By 2025 to 2026 polling consistently showed Harry's favorability in the United Kingdom in the mid to high 20s or low 30s% range, with net negative ratings, while Meghan's figures remained even lower. A substantial and growing share of the public has come to view the Sussexes as a net liability for the monarchy. The consequences reach well beyond Britain. The monarchy remains the constitutional head of state for 15 Commonwealth realms encompassing more than 150 million people across the Caribbean, the Pacific, and the Americas. In several of those countries, the Sussex story has been received less as a tale of personal courage than as evidence of institutional dysfunction. In Jamaica, where Republican sentiment has strengthened in recent years and concrete legislative steps toward a republic have been advanced, the spectacle of a prince publicly at odds with his own family has reinforced arguments for change. In Australia, where the Republican debate has never fully subsided, the prolonged family drama has supplied fresh material for those who contend that the institution is too unstable to serve as a reliable constitutional foundation. In Canada, long characterized by polite indifference to the crown, the relentless coverage of the Sussex conflict has arguably done more to diminish residual support than organized Republican campaigns achieved in previous decades. Harry may frame his actions as a private struggle. The broader record, past commercial gains built on royal capital, present public disaffection in Britain, and the erosive effect on the monarchy's standing in the wider Commonwealth tells a different story. Harry's complaints remain rooted in his personal experience and family dynamics. Yet the practical effects of his choices extend far beyond those boundaries, reaching across the Commonwealth and weakening an institution that, despite its outdated elements, still functions as a shared symbol of continuity for millions who have no involvement in the private disputes of the House of Windsor. This is perhaps the greatest loss in Harry's present path. It is not primarily the distance from his father, the breach with his brother, or even the use of his children's status for public messaging, though the last of these remains the most ethically troubling aspect of the story. The deeper loss is that a man once sincerely devoted to service has allowed a narrative of perpetual grievance to erode the qualities that once set him apart. He was the prince who walked through active minefields in Angola with the Halo Trust, the one who sat with wounded veterans and made them feel recognized, and the public figure who spoke candidly about mental health, helping to normalize discussions of trauma and grief across the English-speaking world. Those were substantive contributions, not marketing exercises. They produced measurable benefits for real people. He has largely set them aside, not in pursuit of a clear cause or principle, but in exchange for a form of freedom that does not exist, a notion of justice that public exposure and private scores cannot deliver, and a vision of fulfillment that no sequence of streaming documentaries or best-selling memoirs has been able to supply. Intelligence briefings and news cycles will eventually fade. Public attention in Britain will shift to newer distractions, and the Commonwealth realms will continue their gradual, uneven movement toward whatever constitutional arrangements lie ahead. Harry, however, will remain Harry, the individual who once held the affection of a nation, the regard of colleagues, and the goodwill of a public that wanted him to thrive, and who chose, repeatedly and deliberately, to burn much of that capital. History is unlikely to focus solely on whether he was wronged in certain respects, and those wrongs merit recognition. The sharper questions will be whether his response was proportionate, whether the strategy was sound, and whether the damage inflicted on his family, the institution, his children, and ultimately himself justified the temporary sense of being heard by an audience that moves on the moment the next celebrity controversy appears. The probable verdict, once the noise subsides, is that it did not. The British monarchy does not operate on emotional transparency. It depends on restraint. It does not prioritize personal storytelling. It prioritizes discretion. It does not elevate the individual. It requires the individual to serve a larger symbolic role. These are not whims or arbitrary customs. They are structural requirements. The institution endures because its members accept the suppression of private feelings in favor of a collective function. When that discipline is abandoned, when the crown is treated as a stage for personal expression rather than a vehicle for national continuity, the foundations begin to weaken. That process is already underway. Harry now employs the vocabulary of California therapeutic culture with a fluency that would have seemed improbable a decade earlier. He speaks of boundaries, generational trauma, cycle breaking, and doing the work. He presents the rupture with his family as courageous self-preservation rather than a failure of responsibility. He frames the public airing of private family conflicts as radical honesty instead of a breach of trust. He casts demands concerning Archie and Lilibet not as matters of established protocol, but as non-negotiable assertions of his children's right to visibility and validation. Each of these formulations is coherent within the cultural environment of Montecito, wellness retreats in Ojai, or therapy rooms in Santa Barbara. Each is fundamentally incompatible with the operating logic of the British monarchy, which does not trade in validation, does not recognize personal boundaries as a basis for institutional change, does not treat generational trauma as grounds for rewriting its rules, and does not concede that a junior member may unilaterally redefine the public status of his children according to private emotional needs. This is the cultural divide King Charles is attempting to navigate, a divide that may prove impossible to close. Charles continues to work within a framework of duty. King Charles continues to work from a foundation of precedent and institutional stewardship. Harry, by contrast, proceeds from emotional authenticity, personal storytelling, and the language of therapeutic self-realization. Their disagreement is not limited to the practicalities of a family settlement. They are using entirely different vocabularies and occupying separate moral frameworks. The reported security concerns that have drawn attention from agencies such as MI6 are, on this reading, less the result of calculated hostility than the natural outgrowth of that deep cultural mismatch. Harry appears sincerely convinced that he is pursuing justice. He appears sincerely convinced that his children are being withheld entitlements that are rightfully theirs. And he appears sincerely convinced that his father's refusal to meet those demands constitutes an act of institutional cruelty, the same systemic failure he has long argued blighted his own early life.